delighted to see this room packed to the brim. 2 weeks ago, we were unsure about this event's prospect, faced with the unfortunate situation of being removed from the MJCCA and the Atlanta Book Festival. Well, thank you. I just want to say thank you to the Margaret Mitchell House for allowing us to be here. Thank you to the MJCCA who secured this location for us. And, I want to say thank you to all of you for coming with your open minds, hungry for a conversation about Israel that is broader than this community has probably experienced in a long while. My name is Lindy Miller. I know many of you. I was born in Atlanta. I was raised by many of the city's great Jewish institutions. I went to Beth Jacob Preschool. I went to the Greenfield Hebrew Academy, B'nai Torah, BBYO, High School in Israel, Camp Barney. My South African parents raised me to love Israel, as did all of those institutions. They also raised me to believe in the equality and rights of all people. So I wrestle with the tension I feel. Peter Beinart's words well capture this tension. He says, "A nation whose Declaration of Independence pledges that it will pursue freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the Hebrew prophets, cannot forever hold another nation, another people in subjugation without surrendering its soul." Mainstream views of Israel requiring uncritical support of its government alienated me. My concerns with Israel's use of power were frowned on, and instead of voicing an unwelcome opinion, I opted out of the conversation altogether. Finding myself back in Atlanta after a 15-year hiatus and trying to find a Jewish place in my hometown, I found myself again estranged from the agenda and conversations about Israel that have too long dominated our city. A friend, Rachel Lerner, encouraged me to learn more about her organization, J Street. So, in 2011, while nursing my then 6-month-old, I tuned into the J Street General Assembly address and heard a man give eloquent voice to my hopes for Israel. His words gripped me. When we ensure that no more Palestinians are evicted from their homes, and no more Bedouin villages are bulldozed, and no more elderly Palestinians die waiting at checkpoints, and no more Palestinian children wade in sewage on the beaches of Gaza, and when we ensure that a Jewish woman can safely carry a Sefer Torah to the Kotel, knowing that it is as much her birthright as it is the birthright of the chief rabbi of Israel, then we will have re-sanctified the land. That man was Peter Beinart. The next week, Dotan Harpak and I launched J Street Atlanta. Together with J Street, we have found a way to influence the conversation. With others, we work to reignite Zionism and reconnect Americans to the future of Israel-Palestine and their peace. Thank you for joining us tonight.
I was hoping that I would get to stand next to that flag for this whole good. Good evening. I'm Dotan Harpak. I'm the chair of J Street in Atlanta. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you, Lindy. Thanks to Margaret Mitchell House for this beautiful setting and for hosting us on such a short notice. And thank you to the JCC for helping us find this location. So we started J Street Atlanta a couple years ago after a few of us had dinner at a local rabbi's house. It was a really nice evening. The food and wine were great. And as things usually evolve in this kind of social events, we ended up talking for hours about settlements in the West Bank. One conversation led to another, and with time, more and more people joined those conversations. And after attending my first J Street National Conference, we knew that we needed to start J Street chapter here in Atlanta. And so we did. Over the past 2 years, we have had dozens of events, meetings, lectures, advocacy trainings, and amazing meetings with local leaders, clergy, and congressmen. To me, as an Israeli, who is relatively new in this town, this evening is very exciting. I got involved in advocating for a two-state solution and for peace the day I was released from my service as a combat soldier in the IDF. I saw and did firsthand some of the things Mr. Beinart wrote about in his book. For the past 10 years, I've been working on Israel education and engagement with American Jews. During these years, I saw and did much of what Mr. Beinart wrote about in regards to how we talk about Israel and its politics here in the US. We've been planning this event tonight for several months. After events I'm sure some of you, or most of you, have already heard about, and which I believe Peter will touch on in his talk. And with the help of the JCC, which helped us secure this beautiful location, we are so happy to have this conversation with you tonight. The warm responses that we got over the last 2 weeks from rabbis, from academics, from members of this community that wrote letters, that wrote articles, that did not stop calling us and writing us over the last 2 weeks, proved to me more than anything else how valuable and important and needed and appreciated this conversation is for us to have here in Atlanta, more than anything else. If you want to find out more about J Street, what we do here in Atlanta, what we do in DC, we would be very happy to explain more. Please find Lindy or myself or any one of the J Street staff after the event, and we'll be happy to answer any of those questions. One more thing before we begin our program tonight, and this is something that I added just a couple of hours ago. Earlier today, as I was going over my remarks for tonight, my Facebook and Twitter feeds were filling up with updates from friends in southern Israel as sirens around them started blasting. As we learned about the new operation of the Israel Gaza border tonight, and the information is still coming in, we keep the civilians in the region in our thoughts, and we hope for a safe and quick and peaceful resolution to this development. It is now my pleasure to introduce Josh Nathan-Kazis. He's a staff writer at the Jewish Daily Forward, which earlier this week singled Peter as one of the most 50 influential Jews in the U.S., but as Josh told me just a few minutes ago, he had nothing to do with that. Where he covered politics and does investigation. He's the host of the Forward's weekly Reporters Roundtable podcast. Previously, he worked as the editor of New Voices, an independent national magazine for Jewish college students, and as the news and politics editor of the Pastor Times. He won a 2011 Deadline Club Award for reporting. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and I hope this will be an insightful and enjoyable conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Can everybody hear me? Is all right? Make sure you have your cell phones off, or at least on silent. Don't want any interruptions when we speak. I want to take a moment to speak for a second about what Nathan just alluded to. We're meeting here tonight at a frankly uncertain and scary moment for Israelis and Palestinians. As you know, if you've looked at the news today, Israel launched a series of attacks to Gaza sometime in the morning, our time, earlier today. It's unclear what's happening or why. There have been days of small attacks back and forth. There's been a serious escalation, and it's unclear where this is going to go. At times like this, we're here gathered to talk about how American Jews think and talk about Israel, and conversations like that can be uncomfortable and awkward when we know that people are dying in the Middle East. But I think we're here because we think that's important, so I think we should have this conversation. I think later Peter and I will hopefully talk about what's happening in Gaza, but I also want to talk about his book, and I want to talk about the other issues that we've been planning to talk about this evening. The plan is that Peter, who I will formally introduce in a second, is going to take a few minutes before he and I speak to talk about the controversy that everyone's alluded to surrounding the evening, and that you probably all read about in the New York Times. Then I'm going to ask Peter some questions, and then you're going to have a chance to ask Peter some questions. We can talk a little bit later about how that's going to go. So I'm happy to have with me Peter Beinart, the author of The Crisis of Zionism. He's also the author of The Icarus Syndrome and The Good Fight, and he is the former editor of The New Republic. He's now the editor of Open Zion, which is an online magazine about Israel and Palestine and American Jews, posted on the Daily Beast website, which is really good. You should all read. And he's a professor of journalism and political science at CUNY, the City University of New York, and a senior fellow at the New America Foundation. With that, the floor is yours.
I'll stand at the beginning. I have to say, this experience has made me feel like I should be boycotted more often. And it actually struck me that there are probably members of my own family who would be happy to travels with me wherever I go, organizing boycotts. When I wrote my book, my wife sent out an email of the kind that spouses sometimes do. She said, "You could agree or disagree with Peter's argument, but we're very proud that he wrote a book." So she got an email back the next day. The person said, "Never buy that book. Peter's a threat to the Jewish people. I wouldn't give him a dime." So my wife forwarded on an email and said, "Who was that that was so angry? Don't you remember? That's my cousin David. I haven't heard from him in years." My mother said it's good that my grandmother doesn't know how to blog. But in all seriousness, last week's Parsha, Torah portion, which was Vayera, and this week's, which is Chayasera, are both in significant measure about hospitality, about the way Abraham responds to the messengers, the angels, when he's still recovering from his bris, as exemplifying the hospitality that is so core to his identity. And then in this week's Parsha, the way that Rebecca responds to Eliezer when Eliezer comes to the well, not only giving him water, but watering his camels. And hospitality is a deep, deep part of the Jewish tradition, and I really honestly have never felt as welcome, so as much hospitality as I have felt here in Atlanta because of the incredible emails and tweets and other messages that I've gotten from people in the past couple of weeks. It really has been, for me, a real, actually, ironically, an embodiment of Hachnasik Rahim, of hospitality, the very hospitality that is talked about in the Torah portion this week. The last thing I wanted to say before saying a little bit about my book itself is that if you were the person here in the audience who thinks you most vociferously disagree with me, then you were the person I want to thank the most for coming. Because too often in the Jewish community and in America more generally, people only go to hear those people who they think they're going to agree with. And that's as true for people on the left as it is for people on the right. So if you were that person who thinks you disagree most passionately with me, then you were the person I am most indebted to for coming tonight. It is a very difficult time to have a conversation about our concerns about Israel when Israelis are living under fire in southern Israel today. And I have to say, although my head says that I still have the right to my own opinions at a time like this, my gut often tells me at times like this that I would really rather just be silent because you see what Israelis live through when they're faced with threats like Hamas and Hezbollah. I'm going to talk, and we're going to talk more about the specifics of Hamas and the events of the last couple of days. But I'm going to talk about my concerns about Israel and the response of American Jews because I really do believe very, very deeply that the struggle against Hamas, the struggle against people who want to destroy Israel, and the struggle for Israeli democracy are the same struggle. That Hamas, one of my closest friends, the person who I thought would be the rabbi at my wedding one day, was killed in a Hamas bus bomb in 1996 along with his fiancée in Jerusalem. And so I've thought a lot about Hamas and read a lot about Hamas over the years. And I truly believe that ultimately the way to defeat groups like Hamas and the ideology that they present is for Israel to be, again, a country that offers the right of citizenship to all people under its domain in the spirit of Israel's Declaration of Independence. I want to start by saying something about why I think that Israel's creation has been such a blessing for the Jewish people. First, it's been a blessing because we now have what we did not have in the 1940s, when our people were being led to the slaughter. That's a country whose mission statement is the protection of Jewish life. And there may be some younger American Jews who take that for granted, but I don't. I still remember as a teenager watching a Jewish state send airplanes to pick up the Jews of Ethiopia, one of the poorest and most reviled communities on earth, and return them to be with the people from whom they had been estranged since the days when the temple stood. The second reason that Israel has been such a blessing for the Jewish people is that we now have We now have a Jewish state based on the revival of Hebrew as a living language. And with all of the problems that we have maintaining diaspora Jewish life today, one can only imagine how much more difficult it would be if we did not have Israel and modern Hebrew to anchor us. But these inspiring accomplishments, I believe, are being put at risk by Israeli settlement of the West Bank and the resulting threat to Israel's character as a democratic Jewish state. Democracy is not the whole of the Zionist dream. Israel is not, in my opinion, should not be a secular democracy like the United States. It should have a special responsibility to the Jewish people. But if democracy is not the entirety of the Zionist dream, it is necessary to the Zionist dream. Theodor Herzl understood this. His novel Unverwandt is largely about an election in an imagined Jewish state between one party who includes Arabs and supports the right of Arabs to vote, and another party that wants to restrict the right to vote to Jews alone. And in his novel, Herzl has one of the candidates who believes in democracy tell the people of this imagined Jewish state, quote, "You must hold fast to liberality, tolerance, and love of mankind. Only then is Zion truly Zion." Israel's founders understood this. In 1948, 3 years after the Holocaust, with the stench of Jewish death still hanging over Europe, and Israel in a war for its very survival against its Arab neighbors, fielding a ragtag army composed in significant measure of people with numbers tattooed on their arms, Israel's founders wrote a Declaration of Independence that promised complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of race, religion, and sex. For me, that democratic vision is crucial to the miracle that is the Jewish return to sovereignty in the land of Israel, and it's a big part of the reason that an Israeli flag hangs in my 6-year-old son's room. I should acknowledge that when we asked our 4-year-old daughter whether she wanted an Israeli flag, she gave a very non-Zionist response. She said, "Only if you can find me one in pink." But that miracle is today imperiled by Israeli control of the West Bank, where in flagrant violation of the principles of Israel's Declaration of Independence, Jews carry identity cards with blue covers that give them citizenship, the right to vote, and the right to be waved through checkpoints. West Bank Palestinians, by contrast, carry identity cards with green or orange covers that deny them citizenship in any state, deny them the right to vote for the government of any state, and severely restrict their travel. Those cards place them under the jurisdiction of military courts, where evidence is largely secret, where people are held for months or even years without trial, and where, according to a recent investigation by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, more than 99% of those tried in 2010 were convicted. Between 2005 and 2010, according to the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, 835 Palestinian minors were brought before military courts in the West Bank on charges of stone throwing. One was found innocent. My point is not that Jews should not be allowed to live alongside Palestinians in the West Bank, the place where, as indeed this week's Parsha itself tells us, the place where we believe that all of our matriarchs and patriarchs are laid to rest. I believe that Jews should be able to live in the West Bank, either as equal citizens in land annexed to Israel in a peace agreement, or as equal citizens in a Palestinian state. The problem is not that Jews live in the West Bank. It's that today the West Bank is a place where, contrary to the vision of Israel's founders, citizenship is ethnically based, where Jews and Palestinians live under a different law. And as David Ben-Gurion himself warned, if Israel makes permanent its occupation of the West Bank, it will be forced to choose between its Jewish and democratic characters. It will invite Palestinians into a one-state struggle that Israel cannot win, because its efforts to maintain itself as a non-democratic Jewish state will make it a pariah in the world. This is what former Israeli Prime Ministers Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert meant when they both warned in the last 5 years of a potential apartheid future and South Africa-style struggle for the character of the one state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. It's what former Kadima leader Tzipi Livni meant when she warned in her farewell speech to the Knesset earlier this year that, quote, the existence of Israel as a democratic Jewish state is in mortal danger. I want to be very clear. I believe the Palestinians do bear significant blame for the failure to achieve the two-state solution that would allow Israel to remain a democratic Jewish state. The Palestinians have badly undermined their cause through the terrorism that I call in my book grotesque, and which sadly continues at this very moment in rocket fire from Gaza. There is a troubling Palestinian tendency to deny the historic connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. And as I say in my book, there are real questions about whether leaders will make the compromises, especially on the right of refugee return, necessary to bring the two-state solution to pass. But even if I conceded every nasty thing that anyone could ever say about the Palestinians, it is not the Palestinians who are essentially paying Israelis to move into the West Bank. It is this Israeli government that has reversed its predecessor and made much of the West Bank a national priority zone eligible for special government subsidies. It is this Israeli government that, according to a report this week in Haaretz, has doubled funding for settlement growth. This summer, a report in the business supplement of the Israeli newspaper Maariv reported that towns and villages in the West Bank, that Israeli settlements in the West Bank receive 70% as much government money per capita as do towns and cities inside the Green Line, and that the most heavily subsidized municipality in the state of Israel is the very radical Jewish settlement in Hebron, which receives 7 times as much money per person as does the large, poor, historically Mizrahi development city of Beersheba in the Negev. And earlier this year, the former director of Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, from this Israeli government, Yuval Diskin, said, quote, forget all about the stories they're selling you in the media about how we want to talk, but Mahmoud Abbas won't. I'm telling you, we're not talking with the Palestinians because this government has no interest in talking with the Palestinians. This government has no interest in resolving anything with the Palestinians. I know from up close. So it's not enough to say that Israel will get a handle on settlement growth when the Palestinians finally decide to live in peace in a two-state solution. Because by supporting settlement growth, you're pushing Palestinians in exactly the direction we don't want them to go. Every time Israel subsidizes more Israelis to move to the West Bank, we make those Palestinian leaders who will reluctantly, I underscore reluctantly, accept Israel's right to exist. We make them, and who are today cooperating against terrorism, as Israel's own defense officials say Mahmoud Abbas and Salam Fayyad are doing, we make them look like fools. And every time Israel makes it harder to build a viable Palestinian state, we make Hezbollah and Hamas stronger. We don't know whether Palestinians will ultimately make the concessions, especially on the right of refugee return, necessary to bring a two-state solution to pass. But we can be darn sure they won't make those concessions if they won't even get a viable Palestinian state in return. So even if you don't believe that a Palestinian state is possible tomorrow, you have, in my opinion, an obligation to try to stop the settlement subsidies that will soon foreclose the possibility of a Palestinian state ever. Zionism at its core, I believe, is about giving Jews control over our own destiny. Settlement growth threatens the core of the Zionist dream because it takes that destiny out of Jewish hands. all of which I think raises a question for those of us here in the United States. Why is the organized American Jewish community so silent? I'll give you the answer that American Jewish leaders offer, and then I'll suggest an answer of my own. The first answer American Jewish leaders give is that it is not their place to criticize Israeli policy, since American Jews don't live in Israel, and thus don't bear the consequences of the policies we propose. Yet those same American Jewish leaders don't live in the West Bank either, or in Gaza, and yet they criticize Palestinian actions all the time. Nor do American Jewish leaders live in Europe, and yet they constantly criticize European governments, usually for their policies towards Israel. And American Jewish leaders didn't live in the former Soviet Union, yet I remember being so inspired as a teenager, watching them move heaven and earth to free the oppressed Jews of the Soviet Union. And American Jewish leaders didn't live in Bosnia, and yet our community was on the front lines against genocide there. In truth, I think, the American Jewish community has a very proud history of speaking out about things that happen in countries in which we do not live. And so why exclude the foreign country, Israel, about which we care the most? Secondly, American Jewish organizations sometimes claim that they can't criticize Israeli settlement policy because a Palestinian state might imperil Israeli security. As it happens, this puts them at odds with the vast majority of Israel's former top security officials, since every former head of the Mossad and Shin Bet, Israel's external and internal security services, who have spoken in recent years, and every former head of the Israeli military except one, publicly favors a Palestinian state near the 1967 line. But even if you think those security officials are wrong, and that Israel needs to maintain military control of the West Bank for security reasons, that still doesn't justify paying Israeli civilians to move into the West Bank. Since after all, if the Arab countries were, God forbid, to invade Israel again, having remote civilian settlements scattered throughout the West Bank would be a security nightmare for the Israel Defense Forces. So even on their own terms, I think, the argument that American Jewish leaders offer for their silence doesn't make much sense. The real reason for the silence, I think, goes deeper. It has to do with the way American Jewish leaders describe the Jewish condition. The only kind of threats to Israel that American Jewish leaders feel comfortable publicly discussing, by and large, are threats from outside. For instance, the threat from Hamas, or the threat from Iran. And I'm glad they struggle against those threats, especially on a day like today. But I think they are most comfortable discussing only those threats, because doing so fits into the familiar narrative of Jews as a weak, menaced, and reviled people. Indeed, to listen to American Jewish leaders often is to believe that fundamentally the Jewish condition has not changed in the last 75 years. At the core of the American Jewish community's unwillingness, I think, to confront the internal threats to Israel's democratic character lies the American Jewish community's unwillingness to recognize that although we still face threats from without, that in fundamental ways today, some of our deepest threats stem not from our weakness, but from our power. Consider the way that we American Jews discuss our holidays. You know, there's a joke that every American Jewish holiday has the same plot. They try to kill us, we survive, let's eat. And there's a reason that American Jews laugh at that joke. And that's because that's the way we retell the story of our holidays. So take the story, the holiday of Purim, which is my daughter's favorite holiday because it brings together two of the things that she loves most in the world, is pastries and dress up. So you say, what's the story of Purim? People say, oh sure, I know the story of Purim. Haman wanted to kill the Jews of Persia, but Esther and her uncle Mordecai, they rose up and they saved the Jews, and well, then the story is really over. and we eat our harmantachas, which are really delicious. But that's not the way the book of Esther ends. The book of Esther does not end with Jewish survival. It extends past Jewish survival. King Ahasuerus gives Mordecai the right to do to Haman's people what Haman's people wanted to do to the Jews. And the book of Esther ends with the Jews of Persia killing 75,000 souls. In other words, it's not just a story of victimhood and survival. It's a story of victimhood, survival, and the struggle to ethically wield Jewish power. A struggle about which our tradition has much to say, and yet we don't talk about that. Or think about the holiday of Hanukkah, which is my son's favorite holiday because it brings together two of the things that he loves most in the world: soldiers and presents. So we're told that the Syrian Greeks wouldn't let Jews practice Judaism, but the valiant Maccabee family rose up and they restored Jewish sovereignty and they rededicated the temple, and the oil lasted for 8 days, which is a miracle. And then the story is really over, and we eat our latkes and donuts, and that's the end. But why did we end the story there? The Maccabees became the Hasmonean dynasty, the last experiment of Jewish sovereignty before our own time. It was a very troubled experience. That's one of the reasons the rabbis of the Talmud didn't like Hanukkah very much, because they knew what the Hasmonean dynasty had become. And yet we don't talk about that, I think, for the same reason we don't talk about the internal threats to Israel's democratic Jewish character. Because we have not developed a language to talk about the ethical responsibilities of Jewish power. And it is this failure to talk about Jewish power, to engage with what our tradition has to say about what comes after victimhood and survival, that I think helps to explain why so many young American Jewish kids feel so disaffected. It's because those kids, more than their parents and grandparents, are growing up with power and privilege in the United States. And they're seeing Israel as a regional superpower in the Middle East. And so it is precisely what our tradition has to say about how to ethically wield Jewish power that could be most relevant to them if we ever talked about it. I think we need to tell young American Jews that as the generation growing up in an age of unprecedented Jewish power, they have been tasked by Jewish history with a very special obligation. That during our long night of powerlessness, Jews spun visions of dignity and justice that inspired the world. But only now, in this age, can we learn the true meaning of those ethical visions. Because of the Jewish tradition of justice, forged in powerlessness, cannot survive the encounter with Jewish power if it cannot inform the actions of the Jewish state. Then, in retrospect, what good was it? We need to tell young American Jews that this Jewish state is their birthright, their patrimony. It was won at a cost in blood and suffering that they can scarcely even imagine. And it was not born to be another Hasmonean dynasty. It was born to live the Enlightenment ideals that Europe had betrayed. We should tell young American Jews that if that kind of Jewish state dies, it will be a stain upon their lives. That Israel's collapse as a democratic project will have as profound an impact on their experience as Jews as Israel's creation had for their parents and grandparents. We should tell them that in the 1960s, not far from here, the best of their parents' generation could have been found struggling for American democracy when American democracy was in its moment of crucible. And that they should find a way to be engaged in the struggle for Israeli democracy. Because although Israel may not be their country, the Jewish people are their people, and their fate is thus intertwined inextricably with the fate of that small nation half a world away. People sometimes ask me these days about conversations I have with folks like my cousin David, who aren't very happy about my book. But in truth, those aren't the conversations I worry about. The conversations I worry about are the conversations I may have one day with my son and daughter, if I'm asked to explain how we, having been given this sacred gift of a democratic Jewish state after 2,000 years, how we squandered it on our watch. I don't want to have those conversations. I want one day to see Ezra and Naomi raise the flag of a democratic Jewish state in their own children's room. That's why I wrote this book. It's why I'm very, very privileged to be with you here in Atlanta tonight.
It's still better. Listening? Yes. Can y'all hear me still? Peter, in your book, you lay out the problem you just described, and you offer two sort of action points. On the one hand, what you call Zionist BDS, which has gotten, I think, most of the attention, and on the other, something that I find equally controversial, which is a proposal for the Jewish community to embrace public funding of Jewish religious schools. I don't know if you specify vouchers or charters or whatever, but I mean, this seems to go beyond. We do have Hebrew language charter schools in New York now. There's a couple in Florida. But these are very explicitly secular because there are very strict laws. But banning what you are proposing, from my understanding, the Jewish community has always been very anxious about breaking down these laws, particularly in public education, because, again, in my understanding of anxieties about what this would mean for a minority religion. I wonder, first of all, if you had any pushback on that proposal, and also whether you worry about breaking down these barriers that have been very important to Jews in this country over the last 50 years.
You're right. This proposal in my book is also very unpopular, but it tends to be unpopular with a different group of people. So perhaps I've managed to find something for everybody to really dislike. I'll tell you how it came to this. I think in the 1960s, and especially into 1970, the American Jewish community realized that it had this problem. And the problem was radical acceptance. How do you deal with a host society that likes you so much that it wants to marry its sons and daughters off to your sons and daughters? This has not been the conundrum that Jews have traditionally dealt with, but it turns out to be quite a formidable problem. And I think the American Jewish community, by and large, tried to use Israel and the Holocaust to give younger generations of American Jews a reason to stay Jewish. And I think, although we should of course remember the Holocaust, and although I believe very strongly that we should be connected to Israel, I think this was a tragic mistake because Israel and the Holocaust are both vicarious experiences. And when you put them together and tell young American Jews they should be Jewish because of Israel and the Holocaust, you're essentially telling them that they should be Jewish because they could be in the Warsaw Ghetto again. It's a very negative vision of being Jewish, and it's not one that's true to people's lived experience. And what I think the Jewish community did not do is invest in Jewish education. And I believe so strongly in investing in Jewish education, not because I'm against intermarriage per se. I believe that love is hard to find in this world. And if you find it, you should marry whoever you want. But for me, the tragedy is that so many young American Jews decide to get intermarried, to not create Jewish families of their own, without having been taught anything by their own community about what it is that they are giving up. They cannot make an informed decision because their own community has failed to instill what I most deeply want to instill in my own children, which is not Jewish observance per se. I know they'll rebel in 1,000 ways. What I want to instill in them, more than anything else, is knowledge of, joy in, and fascination with Judaism. And when we raise a generation of Jewish kids who know about Auschwitz, but have never heard of Simchas Torah, and when we build in city after city new Holocaust memorials in places where the Jewish schools are literally falling down, And so we tell American Jewish parents of my age, the most important thing you can do is to raise a generation of committed Jews. But oh, by the way, if you want to send your children to a full-time Jewish school, you're going to have to take out a second mortgage on your home, and the facilities are going to be awful, and the schools are going to be academically second-rate, but go for it. It's the most important thing you could possibly do. That, to me, is a true betrayal of our responsibility to the next generation, and I don't think it has to be that way. The problem, it doesn't have to be that way, I think, because if you look at Australia, or Canada, or Britain, or France, or South Africa, where my own family is from, you see that people have the option of economically affordable, academically excellent Jewish schools that can get them into the best universities in those countries. The problem is that in a lot of those countries, they do rely to some degree on government funding, especially government funding for the secular aspects of those Jewish schools. And maybe it's because I come out of a community that grew up under that. But in fact, if you talk to Jews from Canada, or Australia, or South Africa, or Britain, or France, where there is government funding, they will tell you that they are very free to practice Judaism. That it is possible to have some level of government support for Jewish schools without creating a situation in which religious liberty is infringed upon. And although I do care very strongly about religious liberty, I think given the realities that we face, as perhaps the wealthiest and most Judaically ignorant Jewish community, at least large Jewish community, in the history of the world, I think our anxieties at this point are somewhat misplaced.
Let me ask you about the other proposal briefly. I'm sure people will come back to it in the questions. The Zionist BDS, you suggested boycotting products from the settlements, but not from within the Green Line. You made that argument, I guess the book came out a number of months ago. Have you seen any move in that direction? Have you seen people adopting that proposal? And the corollary here is, if this were to happen, and if you do see it, I'm not sure I understand what the practical impact would be. And you acknowledge in your book that it's probably, it's hard to say whether this would have a, as a boycott, whether it would actually exert economic pressure. So first of all, is this happening? And second of all, so what?
There have been some places where people have moved to adopt this. I should say one of the people who interestingly has publicly come out in support of some limited version of this actually is, believe it or not, the head of the Weizmann Institute of Science, who recently said that he was going to boycott the creation of the new university in the settlement of Ariel. And in doing so, he was actually joining a whole group of Israeli intellectuals, people like David Grossman and Amos Oz and Aleph Ben Yehoshua and a group of Israel Prize winners, all of whom themselves have said they will not take part in the cultural center in the settlement of Ariel. Now, one of the criticisms of this proposal of mine is that it delegitimizes Israel. But the reason I disagree, and the reason that I don't think that people like Grossman and Oz and Yehoshua saw themselves as delegitimizers of Israel, is because they believe, as I do, that at the core of Israel's legitimacy is its democratic character. And that if Israel can become again a country that offers citizenship and the right to vote to all the people under its domain, that those of us who believe in the Zionist experiment, who believe that liberal democracy and Zionism, although there is a tension between the two of them, that they can be reconciled, that we can go anywhere around the world and make the case for Israel's legitimacy, because we will be showing that Israel can live as a democracy. But if Israel makes permanent its occupation of the West Bank, and permanently controls millions of people who, by virtue of their ethnicity, lack citizenship and the right to vote, it will be harder and harder for us to argue against those people who argue that Zionism is inherently discriminatory. And that's why I believe that in a circumstance in which Israel is subsidizing people today, making it cheaper in many, many ways to live inside the West Bank, we have to do something to try to rebalance the scale, even if our powers are limited. And I think, actually, that if you look at the way the BDS movement works, let me say something about the BDS movement, because my proposal has been criticized as a kind of slippery slope towards full BDS, which I oppose. I only support not buy products from the settlement, if it's in tandem with a public affirmation of the products and services of within democratic Israel. This is how the BDS movement works in practice. The churches, or whoever it is considering this option, they send a study delegation, a study group to the West Bank, sometimes even to Gaza. And I think that's very significant. We need to just stop and pause there for a moment. Because guess who never, by and large, goes to meet with Palestinians living in the West Bank? Us. It's the organized American Jewish community that doesn't send our groups to actually have those experiences. And so we don't often know what they see. And what they see leaves them very, very upset. Because the truth of the matter is, it would leave even the most deeply committed Zionists upset. When you have those conversations with people who are very normal and very decent, and tell you about the 3 or 4 hours they have of water per day in their village, when they can see the swimming pools in the settlement next door, or tell you about what it was like to stand for hours at a checkpoint with their elderly parent or grandparent, makes people very upset. And so what happens is these people come back and they're upset. And the BDS movement says, we've got a great solution for you. Boycott all of Israel. And the American Jewish community, by and large, says, don't do anything, and if you do anything, we're going to call you anti-Semitic. Now, you can win that struggle for a few years, but over time, if Israel moves closer and closer to making permanent its control of the West Bank, I think ultimately you start to lose that struggle. And that's why I thought it was very important to have some way of offering people a way of expressing their opposition to Israeli settlement policy while affirming Israel's right to exist. I will say that the best critique of my proposal, I think, and I've thought about it a lot because it hasn't been all that popular, I think the best critique of my proposal is that it potentially cuts off dialogue. That when you boycott any group of people, and there's actually a long history of Jewish boycotts and of boycotts inside Israel, by the way, for specific programs. I mean, people say that boycott is an inherently un-Jewish idea, but in fact, there are in Israel today, there is something called the social hector, by which groups say, we will only eat at kosher restaurants that we believe are ethically treating their employees. That is a kind of boycott or discrimination between different kinds of institutions based upon your ethical values. It's not un-Jewish, I believe. But what I do worry is that if you boycott any group of people, you cut off dialogue with them. And as I said before, I don't think that Jews who live in the West Bank are bad people. I don't think that their deep attachment to the West Bank is crazy. I understand it myself. I read the same texts that they do. I do think that the law that they're living under is unjust. But I do worry about cutting off dialogue with them because I think we need to be in contact and in dialogue with that community. So having offered the proposal, I will say I think that for me has been the most penetrating critique of it.
Let's move on to what's happening in Gaza today. As we said at the beginning, I'm sure there's more has happened since we've started this conversation, but last I checked, the top Hamas military official in Gaza was killed by an Israeli strike. The Israeli military was talking about the willingness to send troops in. I mean, it sounds like that's certainly on the table. There's some context here. The U.S. elections ended a week ago. Israeli elections are in a couple of months. What do you make of the decision to do this now? There's obviously also a military context. There were lots of rockets coming over from Gaza over the past couple of weeks. This seems like a serious escalation. It's clearly damaged relations, or it seems to have damaged relations with Egypt. What do you make of the decision by the Netanyahu government and the Israeli military to do this this week?
I think Israel has the right to respond to Hamas rocket fire. I think it has that right. And there has been an escalation by Hamas. Not only by Hamas, but Hamas are kind of allowing even more radical groups like Islamic Jihad to launch rockets into southern Israel. And while sometimes people on the Palestinian side say, oh, very few Israelis get killed by these rockets, you don't have to be killed to be utterly terrorized and frightened and have your life completely disrupted by this kind of rocket fire. And I think the Israeli government is right when they say that they should not be expected to tolerate this. But I think saying that Israel has, and I also recognize that when Israel retaliates, innocent people will die. I think it's terrible, I think it's horrible, but I don't think you can hold Israel to the standard that that its military actions can have no collateral damage. It's not possible, especially in a place as closely populated as Gaza, to have no collateral damage. So I'm not a pacifist, I don't hold Israel to a utopian standard. But I do question what Israel's political strategy vis-a-vis Hamas is. Because Israel cannot reoccupy Gaza. It's just not, the only way to really push Gaza, the Hamas out of control, would be to reoccupy Gaza. And I'm pretty sure the Jewish mothers of Israel are not going to sit by and let their 18-year-old sons and daughters basically go and control every city and neighborhood in Gaza. So the question is, what's your political strategy vis-a-vis Hamas? Hamas, unfortunately, won an election in 2006. It's important to say something about the election they won, because it's not talked about enough. The first thing is that the two single biggest reasons given by Hamas voters for voting for Hamas were Fatah's corruption, which was epic, and its failure to maintain law and order. According to Khalil Shikaki, who's the preeminent Palestinian pollster, a majority of Hamas voters said they preferred the two-state solution to the one-state solution. Bill Clinton has mentioned several times that one of the reasons Hamas won that election, which they won with plurality, not a majority, is because Fatah was so stupid, they ran two Fatah candidates in many of the single districts, thus splitting the vote. So then you have this situation where Hamas has won. Israel responds with a blockade. Now, the blockade has become significantly loosened, thank goodness. So there is a lot of a lot of goods that now can go into Gaza. But what people don't often focus on in the Jewish community is that although Israel has been more willing to allow goods in, they still virtually allow no goods out. Which is to say, the Gazan economy as it existed collapsed because Israel doesn't allow people in Gaza to export to the West Bank or to Israel anymore. Also makes it extremely difficult for students in Gaza to go study outside of the Gaza Strip. And that is what allowed Hamas the creation of a new economy through the tunnels that go into Egypt, which they completely control. The business class, which could have been a source of opposition to Hamas, has been shut down. And now Hamas completely controls the economy, which for me raises the question, how effective is this blockade as a political strategy against Hamas? Ask Fidel Castro how effective our blockade in Cuba has been as a political strategy against him. It's been the best thing that ever happened to Fidel Castro. And this is what worries me about the Hamas strategy. It's not that I don't think Israel has the right to military retaliation. I'm thinking the only way you're going to defeat Hamas is politically. The only way you're going to defeat Hamas is by showing that people like Mahmoud Abbas and Salam Fayyad, who are doing security cooperation with Israel. I mean, the reason that you can go into pizza parlors in Tel Aviv today and not fear for your life, at least from the West Bank, is not only because of the security barrier, because a lot of it is not completed. It's because the Palestinians of the West Bank have this leadership is doing security cooperation with Israel. And when they're doing that security cooperation, and they still see the state that they want to build being eaten away by settlement growth, you are empowering Hamas. So I don't see a political strategy vis-a-vis Hamas that really makes any sense on Israel's part. And that's what worries me about these kind of escalation, is that I don't see it mapped to a political strategy, which will do what we need to do, which will be to politically undermine Hamas by showing that the Palestinian leaders who have chosen a different path can actually achieve something for their people by pursuing this different path.
Well, let's talk about the politics. It's been something that has been commented on, a possibility that's been commented on. I mean, what would that mean for your liberal Zionism? Have you played that out in your head? What you do if what happens to you if Lieberman is prime minister?
This is part of the reason I wrote the essay, actually, in the New York Books that was the precursor to my book, was that once I saw the American Jewish organizational establishment, Beinart, essentially apologizing for Avigdor Lieberman once he became foreign minister, and once he became the deputy prime minister of Israel. I began to think, if this man has not crossed the line, then where exactly is the line? After all, we are a community that says that our support for Israel, we don't by and large, outside the Orthodox community, say that we support Israel because the Torah says in Parshat Chayesera that it's our land. We mostly tend to say we support Israel because it shares our democratic values. And so if you really believe that, how can you not publicly object to the ascension to foreign minister of a man who, according to some reports, was in his youth a member of Meir Kahana's explicitly racist party, Ka, who has said that, who ran under the slogan in 2009, only Lieberman understands Arabic, which is a really chilling slogan when you're talking about the language of 20% of your own citizenry, who has said that there should be, that Israel's Arab citizens should be asked whether they will sign a loyalty oath to a Jewish state, and that if they don't, they should lose their citizenship, who has called for jailing Arab Israeli citizens who publicly commemorate their expulsion in 1948, who has repeatedly tried to ban Israeli Arab parties from running in Israel's elections. That's an issue that doesn't get enough attention. In 2009, Lieberman and others tried to ban some of the Arab Israeli parties from being able to run on the grounds that they weren't Zionists. It was only overturned by the Israeli Supreme Court. And they're going to do that again. How can you say that we're proud of Israel? Because Israel gives everyone inside the Green Line, including its Arab citizens, the right to vote. We say, as the Israeli government officials do, that there's an Arab Israeli on Israeli Supreme Court. How can we be proud of that and not be concerned about someone who literally wants to ban some of the most prominent Arab Israeli parties? And I think the problem is that we have gotten so used to offering a series of knee-jerk kind of explanations, excuses for what Israel does, that I think in the Jewish leadership we've lost our ability to make these critical distinctions. You know, I find that the most common response I get if I talk about something like the military court system in the West Bank or a Victor Lieberman, the first response I get to people is, but isn't it so much worse in so many other countries? To which the answer is yes. And so what? I mean, we are. If your first justification is there's worse stuff happening in other places, it means that you're not actually willing to think very much about what's actually happening in Israel. And I think the standard in Israel can be higher, not only because our standard should be higher, but actually because it's critical to Israel's own security that it be higher. And so that's why I think we have to be concerned about this. Likud was historically a party, though it was committed to Greater Israel, also had a liberal streak within it. Jabotinsky, who was the founder of Revisionist Zionism, had a belief in individual rights. You still see it among some of the older Likud leaders, people like Dan Meridor and Ruby Rivlin, the Knesset speaker, and Benny Begin, that they would defend individual rights, at least inside the Green Line. Lieberman's vision, conservative vision, is much more authoritarian than that. And I think that if America, in my experience, liberal Israelis are continually baffled by how it is that an American Jewish community that so prides itself on its own participation in struggles for liberal democracy in this country can be so indifferent to their struggle for liberal democracy in Israel.
Only 10 questions, but I want to ask you about Netanyahu, the Prime Minister now, not the Prime Minister in my hypothetical, and his relationship with Obama. There were a number of stories in the American press, the New York Times, in fact, during the election, which raised the question of whether Netanyahu was investing himself or involving himself in an inappropriate way in the U.S. elections, expressing opinions in support of one candidate or in support of Romney, or at least making statements that seemed to be sort of dog whistles in support of Romney, and whether that was appropriate or not. You at the General Assembly, the Jewish Federation General Assembly the other day, according to a report in Haaretz, said that you didn't think this was a big deal, that you didn't think it was particularly, well, you speak for yourself, but what did you make of what Netanyahu seemed to be doing during the election in terms of explicitly or implicitly supporting Romney, and why is that, or is that not a problem?
So look, if you read my book, you'll see that I'm not a big fan of Benjamin Netanyahu. But on this case, I think we should give him a break. Because in fact, I think a lot of Americans, when it comes to meddling in the relationship, in domestic politics, when it comes to America and Israel, are really hypocrites. Think about it from Benjamin Netanyahu's point of view. When Benjamin Netanyahu was Likud leader, after Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, Bill Clinton sent 2 Democratic political consultants over in 1996 to try to defeat Netanyahu and re-elect Shimon Peres. He failed. But in 1999, he sent 3 political consultants, Bob Schramm, Stanley Greenberg, and James Carville, to Israel to try successfully to elect Ehud Barak and defeat Benjamin Netanyahu. So Benjamin Netanyahu knows very well that no matter what pious stuff we say, there is a deep history of us meddling against him in Israeli elections. And he's done the same thing. He did it during the Clinton administration when he went to Washington right after the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke and went to a rally on a Saturday night led by Jerry Falwell, who was leading the impeachment crusade. Reportedly, Clinton said, when he met Netanyahu the next day, he said to Netanyahu, "I know where you were last night." But the point of this is that Netanyahu didn't start this. Democratic presidents would prefer to have center-left Israeli politicians because prime ministers that make their lives a lot easier. Netanyahu would prefer to have Republican presidents because it would make his life easier. Both sides have done this. And I don't think Netanyahu did it in any particularly egregious way. Now, the big interesting question now is whether Barack Obama is going to return the favor. I think that one of the reasons, I think Netanyahu suspects he will. I think that's one of the reasons Netanyahu scheduled the Israeli elections for January 22nd, so he wouldn't give Obama any time in his second term to try to undermine Netanyahu. I think the interesting question is whether it would be worth Obama's while to try. I think, frankly, Ehud Olmert, who may decide to run, is really counting on some kind of support from the Obama administration in order to boost his chances. And just as I don't think it was illegitimate for Netanyahu to make in veiled ways clear that his policies are more in line with Romney's, I don't think it would be wrong for Obama to lay out again his belief in a Palestinian state near the 1967 lines with land swaps. And Israelis are smart enough to understand that Ehud Olmert agrees with that view and Benjamin Netanyahu does not.
One more. I think some of the most interesting stuff in your book were the chapters about Obama and Netanyahu and their relationship. Now that Obama doesn't have to run again, assuming Netanyahu wins again, or even if he doesn't, do you think that Obama will take his second term to try to make progress towards a Palestinian state? Do you think he'll? I mean, as you wrote in your first book, he kind of gave up. In your book, he kind of gave up during his first term, partway through. Do you think he's going to try again, or not? He didn't talk about it during the campaign.
Yeah, look, I want Obama to try again. I really, really deeply want Obama to try again. But I'm also a journalist who has to try to describe reality as I see it. And so, in all honesty, I think the chances that Obama is really going to beat his head against this big brick wall again are actually quite low. And I'll tell you why. I think, first of all, he simply sees the chances of success as low. You have, assuming Netanyahu stays in power, a strong Israeli prime minister who, although he said he supports a Palestinian state, has made it very clear he does not support the kind of Palestinian state, i.e. 1967 lines with small land swaps that Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak had embraced. That's the only kind of Palestinian state we're ever going to have, with a capital in East Jerusalem. And Netanyahu was very public in May 2011 after Obama proposed this, that he doesn't support that. So I think, plus you have a Palestinian leadership in the West Bank that is very weak and growing weaker all the time. A leadership without democratic legitimacy, which is corrupt, and which doesn't even barely have the money anymore even to pay its own employees. So I think Obama sees the chances of success as low. The chances for political headaches at home, on the other hand, are quite high. People say Obama doesn't have to run for re-election. I'm sometimes reminded when I hear people talk about Obama in his second term vis-a-vis Israel of this skit that I saw on Saturday Night Live years ago after Clarence Thomas was appointed to the Supreme Court. I can't remember who the comedian was who played Clarence Thomas, but it was the first meeting of the Supreme Court after he had been put on the Supreme Court. And Thomas raised his hand and says, "A quick question. is this job for life? And the Chief Justice says, yeah, it's for life. It's for life. And he says, another question. You mean no matter what I do, I can't get kicked off? And the Chief Justice says, yeah. And then Thomas stands up, he takes off his robe, he's wearing a dashiki, he does a black power salute, you know, and he becomes the radical. That's, I think, what some people, for better or for worse, think that Obama would be like vis-a-vis Israel. But the reality is, you understand the way that politics work in Washington vis-a-vis Israel, it doesn't matter that much that Obama doesn't have to run for re-election. Because the pressure that will come on him, the limitations that will come on his ability to have a confrontation with Israel over the peace process comes from Congress. It's Congress that essentially sets the kind of limitations on what an American president can do. And that's where the traditional organized American Jewish community has its powers, where Jason is working very hard to change things, but still early on in that process. And so, if Obama has another confrontation with Netanyahu, like he did in 2009 over the settlements, in 2011 over his speech, it will be the Democrats in Congress who are raising money for the 2014 elections will say, excuse me, you may not have noticed, but we have to run again. And we're busy trying to raise money to maintain the House, which I imagine, maintain the Senate, which I imagine you would like as well. And this is impairing our fundraising, because I had a conversation with Mr. Shapiro last week on the phone. You may remember Mr. Shapiro, lovely man, very generous to us in 2012. Well, he's not supporting us because of the fight you're in with Netanyahu. So can you please cut it out? That conversation will still take place even if Obama is not on the ballot. The other thing that I think is important to understand is that there are many, many other issues that Obama's going to have to deal with. When Clinton focused on the peace process in his second term, he didn't have to worry about the things that Obama has to worry about. Iran, which is going to take a huge amount of Obama's attention. The civil war in Syria, the potential for relations with Egypt going completely off the rails. And beyond that, and even more importantly, the Democratic foreign policy types are just desperate to refocus from the Middle East on to Asia. The Obama foreign policy people feel like they spent the first 4 years basically cleaning up George W. Bush's messes in the Middle East and South Asia. They feel like basically it's a losing game where the best they can do is keep things from going from bad to worse. And they want to focus on Asia, which they feel like has been neglected by American foreign policymakers, which it has. And remember, every Secretary of State wants to be Dean Acheson, right? Famously Acheson said, president of the creation, the person who lays out a new strategic doctrine, as Truman and Acheson and George Kennan did at the dawn of the Cold War for America's relationship with Europe. You can imagine that you could be the president and Secretary of State who does that vis-a-vis Asia, because no one has really defined what relation between America, China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, India. It's a very interesting geopolitical puzzle. And I really think, I suspect, that that's going to be where the Obama administration tries to stake its claim. You notice that where did Obama go right after re-election? He's going to Asia. And I suspect that will be a much bigger focus.
Well, that's really interesting. I think it's time to open this up. Somebody's going to go around with the microphone, or people can just stand up and shout. You'll take that microphone, I'll give you the other. Please keep your questions short and make them questions, and that's all.
George, you believe that a Jewish state and democracy are not incompatible?
Yes.
And could you explain that to me?
Sure.
If Israel were fully democratic,
Yes.
what's the guarantee that it will remain a Jewish state?
That's a great question. I think that the idea of a state that has a special obligation to the Jewish people and a state whose declaration promises complete equality, irrespective of race, religion, and sex, I think there is a tension there. But I think it's first worth acknowledging that Israel is not the only country that faces that tension. There are many European democracies that have crosses on their flags, and there are many European democracies, especially in Eastern Europe, that have preferential immigration policies for one ethnic group. So there is a tension. But you can believe there is a tension between two principles without believing that one principle is illegitimate, right? I mean, I can acknowledge there's a tension between economic development and environmental protection, or between national security and civil liberties, without believing that either of those goals is illegitimate. So I start from the belief that democracy is a very, very precious human value, right? And there are all kinds of basis for that, but even in the Torah itself, it's worth noting that the Torah does not start with the Jewish people. You have to get 3 parshas into the Torah to even get to Jews, right? The parsha starts with human beings. The Torah starts with human beings. so I believe that we have a basis for the idea of human equality. But I also believe that 2,000 years of Jewish history means that if other peoples who have suffered far less have states dedicated to their self-protection, then we have the right to a state that has Jewish self-protection as its defining mission, as embodied in the right of return. The idea that Jews in danger will have a place to go. So then the question for me is, how do you bring these two things towards greater harmony, recognizing that perfect harmony may be impossible? And I would just say this. The first thing is that Israel has to stop discriminating against its own Arab citizens in the allocation of resources. The Orr Commission, which Israel's own government commissioned in 2003, said that Israel's treatment of its own Arab sector, inside the Green Line, citizens, had been characterized by discrimination and neglect. There's no reason that schools and roads and hospitals in Arab towns and villages need to get less money. Israel could solve that without threatening its identity as a Jewish state. And the only prime minister who really did this was Yitzhak Rabin, who built dozens of health clinics in Israeli Arab towns and villages, who equalized the childhood allowances for Arab and Jewish families, who instituted affirmative action for Israel's civil service. And I think Israel desperately needs to do that again, to try to bring these principles of democracy and Zionism in closer contact. Because when it does the opposite, when it does what Lieberman does, which is basically to tell Arab Israeli citizens that they are essentially second-class citizens, a threat to take away the rights that they do have, you make them more and more radicalized, more and more hostile, which makes Israeli Jews feel that they are more and more of a threat, which pushes Zionism and the possibility of true equality further away. I think the second point to make is, I really believe that the creation of a Palestinian state helps to legitimize the Zionist enterprise. Why? Because you could say, how can you have a national anthem that talks about the Jewish soul? How can you have a state that has a preferential immigration policy for Jews? Those are easier questions to answer if Palestinians, even those Arab Palestinians who live inside Israel, can look to a Palestinian state which has a Palestinian national anthem and a Palestinian right of return and Palestinian symbols. And so even if they live in Israel itself, they can at least see one country in the world that represents their national identity. And I think those two things together, truer equality for those Arab Israelis who live inside Israel, and the creation of a Palestinian state so there are national collective rights to self-determination for Palestinians on some territory of land, I think, is the way towards a truer reconciliation.
I'd like to say that I think that the decision to rescind your original invitation was essentially a validation of one of the central points of your book, which was the unmitigated power of the old line leadership of the community. You went into some detail about that in your book, and I think that gets lost in the conversation about the little bitty part at the end about the BDS. So if you would please address some of the issues that you identified with the leadership of the major Jewish organizations in this country and how they unduly influence our Congress and how that plays into our relationship with Israel.
So I think to understand what's happened to American Jewish organizations, you have to understand that in the post-war decades, in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, Israel was not the central animating agenda of the organized American Jewish community. The defining issue, I mean, the ADL and the American Jewish, the Anti-Defamation League of the American Jewish Community did not even have offices in Israel until the late 1960s. The AIPAC was, even into the 1970s, such an obscure organization that in the memoir of the person who led AIPAC during that time, he said that people were constantly confusing AIPAC with OPEC. He would say, I work for AIPAC, and they would say, OPEC? It was actually almost bankrupt. The dominant focus of the American Jewish community in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s was civil rights. The American Jewish Congress had more lawyers on its staff devoted to civil rights than did the NAACP or the Department of Justice. The head of the American Jewish Committee and the American Jewish Congress were always on the NAACP's board. It was the defining issue of American Jewish life because Jews saw it as in their enlightened self-interest to push for full equality for the most historically disenfranchised group in the United States, knowing that that would secure our own equality. It was a wonderful example of enlightened self-interest. But the problem by the 1970s was it had succeeded. And so the question was, what was going to be the founding organizational principles of the American Jewish community? I think that the turn should really have been towards Jewish education. And it should have been towards Israel, but with a recognition that Israel's threats were from within instead of without. Instead, I think what happened was the American Jewish community took the Holocaust in Israel and put them at the center of their Jewish organizations, essentially telling the community the message that we are under perpetual threat, the world is not fundamentally changed, and that should be at the core of our identity as Jews. The other thing which is really important to understand sociologically is that starting in the 60s and 70s, Jews start leaving Jewish organizations because they're assimilating. So why do they need to be involved in Jewish organizations anymore? It seems kind of small time. In the 1950s, if you wanted to be involved in liberal political politics or social action, you might get involved in a group like the American Jewish Congress. A blessed memory, it no longer exists anymore. But partly because you just didn't feel totally comfortable outside the Jewish community. But by the 70s and 80s, for goodness sake, Jews are basically populating every single liberal group in America. So the people who want to be involved in Jewish organizations diminishes. You have a smaller group of people. And that group of people is by nature, because they don't want to be involved in larger, they are more tribal, more conservative. And so you start to see that groups like the ADL and the AJC reinvent themselves as Israel advocacy organizations, partly because that's what they can fundraise off of. That the people who want to be involved in the Jewish organizations are the people who naturally gravitate towards that set of concerns. And there's one other issue that I think is really important to understand. It doesn't get talked about very much, and I don't even talk about it in my book, but I'm going to write something about this, I think. And it is the impact of income inequality inside the American Jewish community. Income inequality, the massive increase in income inequality in the past decade has changed everything in American politics. And it's changed American Jewish politics too. Why? Because the Jewish organizations used to be more mass-based organizations, which relied on a larger number of smaller donors. And that meant that if a few people got upset at you, it wasn't such a big deal. Today, the Jewish organizations rely on a much smaller group of much larger donors because we have a lot of the 1%, good for us, in our midst, right? And so when those people threaten to pull their money because they're not happy, it's a real crisis for organizations. I sometimes ask rabbis who say they don't want to speak out about Israel, about their concerns about Israel. They'll say, well, people are going to leave. And I say, okay, but aren't people going to come too? Some people might actually like that message. And I often hear them say, yeah, but the people who leave will be the people who have money. And the people who come will be younger people who don't have money. And I think that actually structures a lot of this. And so I guess I would say, if you're concerned about this, then you need to try to be involved in these organizations such that they have a way of sustaining themselves if one or two big donors who may be a little more to the right. Because the truth is, extremely wealthy American Jews are more conservative than the rest of the American Jewish community. They may say it's because of Israel rather than because of tax cuts or whatever, but the truth is the two are really intertwined. And so if you don't like that, then you have to think about who's going to sustain those organizations if those people aren't.
So I think that even if you're right that most people here support state solution, and even you could convince most Jews in the South or the States, I don't see how this can be helpful or relevant in a way, because what really matters, I believe, is the public opinions of Israelis, which since I left there in 1997 has been sliding significantly to the right in a very depressing way, up to the point that Shadi Yefimowicz said that the Labour Party was never left just because she knows she will not be voted for. I saw an interview with Hava Lon from Meretz, or maybe the Zionist party that called itself left. And the interviewer asked her, well, obviously your voice is not relevant, but say it anyway. And she kind of said, yes, for now it's not relevant. So how can you take these ideas and try to make a difference when in Israel it goes all the way to the other way?
Well, look, I never said that I was optimistic, right? I mean, I mean, since when are Jews supposed to be optimistic anyway, right? We're supposed to have hope. I think that's what we're supposed to have. And there are a lot of other times in Jewish history where it would have been easy to be even less optimistic. I think you're absolutely right. But I also think two things. I think we have seen the emergence of Israeli leaders, even those who come from a right-wing revisionist background, like Ehud Olmert and Tzipi Livni, especially Olmert, who have really come to, in a very powerful way, really to be willing to go very far towards supporting the creation of a Palestinian state. Olmert went much further than Ehud Barak had gone in 2000 and 2001. And he wants to return to politics. We'll see whether he has any chance or not. We don't know. The chances are not great that he would win. But Tzipi Livni got one more seat in 2009, her Kadima, than Netanyahu. It's true, the right was a bigger bloc. But it was not, it's not impossible to imagine that the center-left could be in power in Israel again, especially, I think, if, and this is getting a little bit into the weeds, but if labor is larger, if Olmert were to run and get 25 seats, and Shelley Yakovovich in labor, you're right, she's not liberal on these issues, but she could go into the government with another 15 or 20 seats. And then if you were to have Shas, and this is, Aryeh Deri has returned to Shas. Deri is a fascinating character, but one of the things that makes him fascinating is that he's actually somewhat dovish, or at least open-minded when it comes to the Palestinians. Unlike the person who's been leading Shas recently, Eli Yishai, who's to the right of everybody. And so you could conceivably have a coalition of Olmert, of Yakumovich, and of Shas that could potentially get you close. And I think that for American Jews, it's true that Israelis, understandably, want to make their own decisions. They don't want to be told what to do by us or anybody else. On the other hand, I think Israelis understand that Israel's relationship with the United States is its most important strategic success since its founding. There are not a lot of other superpowers in the world that are dying to be Israel's best friend. And if you look at the way Israeli leaders act when American Jews really get upset about things like the rights of non-Orthodox Jews, which is the one thing we do really get upset about because that's where our ox is gored, you see that it can have an impact on the leadership of Israeli prime ministers. And I think if American Jews were able to muster some of that same outrage and concern vis-a-vis the potential death of the two-state solution, then I think it might have some impact on Israeli politics.
I wonder if we could take sort of 2 or 3 questions in a group, if that's all right. So you and then we'll go through.
Can you tell us why the United Arab League has not done more to give the Palestinians foreign aid, and in fact, why they don't even allow Palestinians to become citizens of the country? They can work there, but they can't become citizens.
Can we just take maybe 2 more and then let you respond to other people want to have questions they want to ask? Or? Yes? Okay. You can just shout maybe while you look here. Yeah.
One of the, when you were talking about the Americans not speaking up, one of the things that I remember us being told is if we show any kind of a fraction in our support of Israel, then the people in Congress are going to say, well, they don't really care. And if they're not united, then we really don't have to bother with them. So that is one of my fears.
Yeah.
When we talk about that.
Let's just take one more. Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
I would like to know what your view is regarding Obama's just his ability in the Arab Muslim world to force a two-state solution, the matter he's regarded to have credibility.
Okay, great, thank you.
Arab League fracturing.
Okay, so let me start with fracturing. Look, I want American Jews to continue to lobby for foreign aid to Israel, especially for things like Iron Dome, Arrow system, which protect Israeli lives. But I think we worry more than we should about the idea of airing our dirty linen in front of the Gentiles. Right? First of all, the Gentiles are perfectly able to turn on the internet or TV and see anything they want to see about what Israel does. They don't need to tell us to tell them. Secondly, we have a very deep and honorable tradition, I think, of airing our dirty linen in public. I mean, is there any text which shows Jews acting as badly as the Hebrew Bible? I mean, you know, my goodness. I mean, we're seeing it right. I mean, you know, you look at the story next week at Jacob and Esau. I mean, it's deeply dysfunctional stuff. Not to mention once you get to, you know, to Navi, to the prophetic books, where you basically see Jewish kings acting terribly in all kinds of ways. And it's funny, anti-Semites throughout our history have in fact used the stories in Tanakh as a way. I mean, right? There's the famous story of the Roman emperor who during the discussion of the martyrs, right? We read on Yom Kippur, basically says, "Who is paid for the fact that the brothers sold Joseph into slavery? Nobody is paid. I'm going to take revenge on you because I read it in the Bible that you did this terrible thing. That the brothers did this terrible thing to their brother Joseph." So, but we've always believed, I think, that it was more important to be honest and to hold ourselves to a higher standard. And I will say, in my experience, especially with Arabs and Muslims, when they hear Jews criticizing Israel, the response in my experience is not often the one you expect. I'll give you an example. After I wrote my essay about the failure of the American Jewish establishment, a young American Muslim intellectual came to me and he said, "I was really interested in your essay, I want to talk to you about it." I thought, oh, I know he's going to say that, you know, how terrible all these things Israel did and how great it is that it's even worse than I know. That's not what he said. What he said was, we have so many problems with our Muslim establishment in the United States. So many of the same problems. So many that they don't understand democracy, they don't understand America. What have you learned in your struggle against the American Jewish establishment that could help us in the Muslim community? I met an Arab journalist who said to me, "I hate going to Israel," she said. "They treat me so badly at the airport, I hate it there." But then she said, "I will say this, there's one thing I love about Israel." She said, "I love watching the Jews argue with one another." Because that's what we don't have in the Arab countries. We don't have that tradition of public discourse. Even if you look at some of the Palestinians like Marwan Barghouti, who come out of Israel's prisons, they, bizarrely enough, even though they've been fighting against Israel, have some admiration for Israeli democracy and for that spirit of public discourse. So I think it actually strengthens us and makes us look good. On the question of the Arab countries, some Arab countries did give citizenship to Palestinians. So for instance, although Palestinian refugees did not get citizenship in Lebanon and Syria, where they're treated very shamefully, they do have citizenship in Jordan. And actually in Jordan, Palestinians have held every position of power except for the position, you know, except for being in the monarchy itself. So there are positions in the Arab world where the Palestinians actually do enjoy citizenship and have a fair amount of prominence. I agree with you that the Arab countries have often treated the Palestinians very badly. These are cynical, often tyrannical governments, and there's often plenty of bigotry and discrimination vis-a-vis Palestinians, especially in the countries of the Gulf. I think also today you're finding that the Arab countries are less willing to fund the Palestinian Authority, frankly, partly because they believe that what they're doing is basically funding Israel's occupation. I mean, the Palestinian Authority has become essentially a subcontractor for Israeli control in the West Bank. They are basically doing the policing in the West Bank that Israel doesn't want to do directly. And so a lot of the Arab countries, and not only the Arabs, but the Europeans, say, wait a second. Before the creation of the Palestinian Authority in 1993, Israel had to do this itself. It had to send its own troops to do this. It had to pay the bills. Now, the Palestinian Authority does it for Israel, and we foot the bills. And yet, Israel doesn't listen to us. So why should we continue to do this? So I think this is part of the reason that you're seeing this funding crisis in the Palestinian Authority. On the question of Obama, Obama's lost a lot of credibility in the Arab Muslim world, I think, partly because our client states have fallen by the wayside, and partly because he hasn't really done what they would have wanted him to do on the Palestinian issue. And my fear is that increasingly countries like Egypt and Turkey are no longer basically going to be America's allies in the peace process, basically are kind of helping follow our lead as they did in the 1990s, but are basically going to take an independent path, and they're going to put more and more pressure on Israel in a way that is not going to be, that Israel is not going to be very happy about, and we're not going to be very happy about. But I do think what we still have to build upon, and Obama still has to build upon, is the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002. The Arab Peace Initiative is not perfect. I'm not saying that Israel should have signed on the dotted line in terms of what was offered. It shouldn't have. But when every Arab country offered to recognize Israel's right to exist, if it returned to the 67 line and there was a just and agreed upon solution to the refugee issue. And the devil is in the details here, but still it was very significant even that they used the word agreed upon when it came to the refugee issue. I think it was a tragic mistake that Israel did not respond to that. We always talk about the Palestinians never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity, and they have. I call in my book Yasser Arafat's response to, in the beginning of the second Intifada, I call it a crime. But I think Israel's non-response to the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002, which was re-offered again in 2007, the Palestinian Authority took out ads in Hebrew in Israeli newspapers to advertise the Arab Peace Initiative. And when the Israeli governments didn't respond in a meaningful way, I think that undermined the leadership that had gone out on a limb to some degree. And I think it's really important that we try as much as possible, if it is possible, for America to act while that's still on the table. Because I think on the day that it's withdrawn, then I think the chances for peace will be much diminished than they are today.
I think that's all the time we have.
And Peter,